If you're struggling to figure out how to get your podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast and everywhere else, this is the video for you. I'm going to walk you through the exact steps to upload and distribute your podcast the right way so you don't waste time with the wrong distribution strategy. We'll cover podcast hosting, RSS feeds, SEO tips, and more. And stick around because at the end, I'll give you some bonus strategies to grow your podcast and get more listeners this year. Let's dive in.
You got to just press record.
So before you even think about uploading, you've got to get the foundation of your podcast dialed in with good planning and prepping of your podcast. So this step one will help you stand out in a crowded market space and attract the right audience from day one. So the first thing here is making sure you chose a really strong podcast title. Your title is that first impression people are going to get about what your show is even about. So typically your title should include some sort of strong keyword that your typical audience member would recognize or be searching for. You also want your podcast title to be pretty clear and concise. It doesn't need to be too long and also doesn't need to be like overly clever or witty or complex. So just something that's pretty easy to say, easy to spell as well. One of our podcast names here at Think Media for a show we have with Sean is called our Coffee with Cannell show, where Sean answers people's YouTube questions while talking about whatever coffee he's drinking that day. So that's a pretty fun example and a simple example of a good podcast title. Now you also want to think about a potential tagline that you could have for your show. So a tagline would be sort of like an elevator pitch or a short description, maybe 1 to 2 sentences that tells people exactly what your podcast is about and why they should listen, right? So include things like, who is your podcast for? What problem does it solve for your users? And why should they care about listening to your specific podcast? And beyond your title and your tagline, you want to think about your target viewer and your ideal audience member. So at first, you don't really want to focus on speaking to everybody. You want to speak directly to your ideal listener. A phrase we often say at Think Media is, if you try to reach everybody, you'll end up reaching nobody. So we want to hone in our focus on our ideal target listener. What are their biggest struggles or their biggest pain points? What platforms do they use on a typical basis? Are they on YouTube? Are they on X? Are they on Discord? Do they prefer Instagram or TikTok? These are all things you want to know about your target listener. And this is where you'll also want to do a little bit of competitive analysis and figure out what podcasts your listener is already listening to and how they're spending their time on these different podcast listening platforms. So all of these factors kind of come together for this first step in planning and preparing your podcast for distribution, because laying that great foundation is going to set up your distribution strategy for success. Now, our next step is going to be choosing a podcast hosting platform. So a platform like this is an online service that stores your episodes and then organizes them and then sends them out to places like Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc., so that people can listen to them. It does this by using an RSS feed, which we'll talk about later in this video. So without using a podcast hosting platform, you'd have to manually upload your episodes to every podcast directory, which really is just not scalable. And some platforms like Apple Podcasts require you to use a distribution site to get the content onto their platform anyways. Now, other sites like Spotify does allow you to host your podcast directly with them, but if you wanted your podcast to live on other sites as well, you would need to go the route of using a distribution site. Some popular sites and ones that we have used before at Think Media are things like Transistor, Buzzsprout, Libsyn, and Podbean. These are all really popular sites, and there's a ton of others as well. Right now at Think Media, we are using Buzzsprout to host and distribute our podcast, but this video is not sponsored by Buzzsprout or anybody else. But if you're curious of what we're using, it is Buzzsprout right now. Once you've selected what site you want to host your podcast with, usually you need to sign up and create an account with that platform. And then you'll need to upload some things like your podcast cover art, as well as your podcast details, like your title, your description of your podcast, maybe the category of podcast that you're creating, and things like tags, depending on what your hosting platform allows you to upload. Ideally, at this point, you'd be ready to record your first few podcast episodes and get those uploaded to your hosting site to get them prepped for distribution. So now that your hosting site is dialed in, this brings us to step 3, which is we need to distribute our show to platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcast and Amazon Music, etc., by leveraging an RSS feed for distribution. So what's an RSS feed? What does it stand for? It stands for really simple simple syndication. And in the podcasting world, it's just kind of like a unique URL that holds all the essential information about your podcast, including things like your podcast title, the description of your podcast, your cover art, so that album artwork, it has that information, as well as things like individual episode titles and descriptions, and audio files as well. And some distribution sites even support RSS video feed distribution if you wanted to send a video podcast somewhere that allows for video podcast RSS feeds. So how this works is your hosting platform can automatically create an RSS feed link for your show, and you can usually find it in your account dashboard somewhere or under podcast settings or RSS feeds, something like that. It's usually pretty easy to find. So every time you upload a new episode to your distribution site, the RSS feed automatically updates across all of the different platforms like Spotify and Apple Music and everywhere else, meaning you don't have to manually upload your episodes to all of those different platforms. So this saves you a ton of time. And that brings us to our fourth step, which is actually submitting and claiming your podcast on these different platforms. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Craig, I thought you said I could just take the RSS feed and upload it and it's going to just do all this magical work for me and I don't have to do a bunch of stuff on Spotify and all these other places. Well, that is true, except for the initial setup for these different platforms. So places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, they want to confirm that you're actually the account owner of your podcast and that your show is going to be listed correctly, and also want to get you access to the backend analytics that these platforms provide. So for getting your show on Apple Podcasts, you can just head to Apple Podcasts Connect and then sign in or create an account. And really it's just as easy as pasting in your RSS feed to claim your show. And then there'll be some forms you need to fill out and submit for approval. And it's actually pretty easy and takes only about 5 minutes. For Spotify, it's very similar. Just head to Spotify for Creators, and that's where you're going to claim your podcast and verify ownership and submit your podcast for approval. All of these other directories are very similar. So YouTube Music, which is now replacing what used to be Google Podcasts. So Google Podcasts is not a thing anymore. It's now YouTube Music, or even places like Amazon Music, iHeartRadio. These are all going to be really similar processes for submitting an RSS feed to verify ownership. Please remember to do this step or you're not going to be able to see your podcast on these different sites. And now our fifth step is leveraging SEO or search engine optimization for your podcast discovery. So now that your podcast is live on major platforms, the next big challenge is getting people to actually find your podcast. Because unlike YouTube, where an algorithm pushes content to new viewers, a podcast directory relies heavily on search-based results and external content promotion. So this is where good SEO practices really come in. So we've already mentioned a few of these things, but we want to make sure we're optimizing episode titles. So using clear searchable keywords in your episode titles are really important. And also using long tail keywords that are really specific can be a lot more helpful than really broad episode titles that are oversaturated. So an example of like a long tail keyword phrase would be maybe you're in a fitness niche or something, but you could have an episode title called 12 Daily Fitness Activities for Busy Moms with Toddlers, right? That's like super specific. And that's my wife right now, right? She's a busy mom with 2 kids. We have a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. And this would be a great podcast title for getting her interested in listening to that episode. It's also really important to have detailed show notes and descriptions for your episodes. So including things like timestamps or good descriptions with key takeaways or outcomes from the episode, and leveraging keywords like we mentioned. So all of those hot button topics or phrases that are really present and prevalent within your niche are important to include in your show notes and description. You could also consider transcribing your audio or video podcast into a written text form, which then allows you to leverage that text in a multitude of ways. You could consider repurposing your podcast episode into a blog post for additional organic traffic, and you could show up in search results better this way on Google potentially. You could also leverage those transcripts for email marketing campaigns and notifying subscribers of when new episodes launch and pulling certain text or key points from those episodes and including those in your email marketing campaigns to drive traffic to the long form podcast episodes. These are all great strategies for SEO and discoverability, but I want to leave you with 4 additional tips about marketing and growing your podcast this year. The first being you've got to have good social media promotion to grow a podcast this year. So we really encourage you to share audio snippets or video clips on Instagram Reels and TikTok and YouTube Shorts. Just post as many places as you can, even on X, post episode highlights about your podcast, or go to places where professionals hang out like LinkedIn or different Facebook groups. So wherever relevant, get your content on as many platforms as you possibly can. Here at Think Media, we're obviously huge fans of YouTube, so ideally that's one of the first places that we'd encourage you to get your podcast content onto. The next tip is just good collaboration and guest sharing of episodes when they release. So one of the best growth strategies has been and will continue to be interviewing guests who are an authority in your niche already, or maybe are on a book tour. And anybody who's writing a book typically would love to come on a podcast, even if it's on a smaller channel. So you could reach out to some of these people in your specific niche to do some podcast interviews. And anytime you have a guest on your podcast, you want to treat them like royalty, bless them, get them as much content as you possibly can, get them shorts that you repurpose, get them behind the scenes photos. If you have a physical set where people are coming to do your podcast in person, take awesome photos of them that they want to share on social media. This truly is one of the best ways to grow your podcast. Our next tip is to leverage email as much as possible. So whether that's an existing email list that you already have or starting a brand new email list from scratch, it's really important to have an owned audience that you have a direct connection to and not always have to rely on these different algorithms on these platforms for your distribution. If you have an email list, this is a built-in group of people who have given you their email and you have a direct line of communication too. So ideally you can send out episodes via email to your newsletter audience, and ideally you can sort of engage with your email community a little bit more through Q&As and polls and different listener shoutouts. So email remains one of the best ways to grow an audience. And finally, we sort of already mentioned this, but we can't understate the importance of getting your podcast up on YouTube and maybe even leveraging the video podcasting format. So if you're somebody who only does an audio version of your podcast, you should really consider converting that to a video podcast. And if you want to see how to start a video podcast this year, you can click or tap the screen right here to check out that video. Thanks for watching this one, and we'll see you in the next one.